Hey guys, welcome back. If you're new here, my name is Becca and today I have my most disappointing reads of 2020. So this will be the first of my end of year list videos, as well as my disappointing reads. In the coming days you will also have my most surprising reads, my worst reads, and also my best reads of 2020. And then throughout the month we have some other fun stuff like my 2020 series wrap up and also my reading statistics. But for my disappointing books, these are not the worst books of the year. A lot of these I didn't actively dislike. I do think that a lot of them are 3 stars, but these are books that I went into expecting to really enjoy for one reason or another that I will explain throughout this video, and for various reasons they did fall flat for me. So getting straight into it, the first one is the only one that I do not own. I gave my copy to my best friend Ryan because he actually does really enjoy this book, and that is Blood Heir by Emily Wenzel. So this book is categorized as adult in the UK but young adult in the US, so for the purpose of this video I will be referring to it as an adult book because I am in the UK. So this is an adult fantasy book that is a retelling of Anastasia. We are following a princess called Anastasia who 1 year prior to the start of this novel had to run away from home because she was framed for the murder of her father. So she wants to clear her name and reclaim her kingdom. So to do this she goes to a high security prison and breaks out the notorious criminal Ramson Quicktongue and makes a bargain with him that if he helps her track down the person who actually killed her father, then she will use her magical powers to help him get back at his enemies. So my first thing that I had with this, it wasn't a big deal in terms of my enjoyment of the book. I didn't like it for other reasons, but one of the things I was most excited about with this book was that it was an Anastasia retelling. I know the basics of the actual historical recounting of the Romanov family, but the Anastasia animated movie is one of my favorite movies of all time. I absolutely adore this. Going into this I didn't know whether it was going to be a retelling of the historical account or the animated movie, but to me it just did not compare to either in any way, shape or form, aside from the fact that the character arc of Ramson Quicktongue very much mirrors the character arc of Dimitri in the animated movie. One thing that really frustrated me about this book is that it felt very circular. By the time we got to the end of the book I felt like the characters had not really progressed. They almost literally ended in the exact same position that they started out in, which just kind of left me thinking, why did I read this book? I also just really struggled to focus and take in the information that was presented to me. I didn't know whether it was a me thing or a book thing, but I do believe that I read other books alongside this one and it was just this one that really wasn't holding my attention. The magic system in here is called affinities, and people with affinities are treated like slaves in this world. A lot of them are actually slaves, and our main character has the ability to control people's blood, so she can literally manipulate the blood in their bodies and like physically lift them up with their blood and like hurl them across the room. There are different affinities throughout this. We have people with an affinity to air who can fly, people with affinities to flesh, to bone, things like that. And throughout the book this seemed quite cohesive, although I would have liked a breakdown of the exact types of magic and how they could manifest. But then we got towards the end of this book and there was a character who very specifically had an affinity to marble, and it just felt like the characters had whichever affinity they needed to make that particular scene more interesting, and there wasn't too much cohesion or consistency to the magic system, which personal preference is not my taste. I like a hard magic system that has specific limitations, and I do like things like orders and casts. One of my biggest gripes with this book is that we have a character who is set out from the beginning to be an enemy character, and as we come up to the conclusion of the book this character just keeps switching sides every few pages. So we think he's an enemy, we find out that he may be on the side of good, 2 chapters later he's an enemy again, he's back to the side of good, and this character was pretty much fulfilling every role that needed to be fulfilled in the conclusion of this plot. And by this point, along with the random person who had an affinity to marble who was only present in one scene, this book just kind of lost all of its plausibility and believability to me. The next one we have is Orange Future by Ichigo Takano. Now I have not read a whole ton of manga at this point, but the Orange manga series is currently my favorite manga series of all time. This is a collection of 2 short stories that take place in the Orange universe after the events of the main story. Now if you guys are unfamiliar with Orange, it is a contemporary manga series with a science fiction element, and it is about a teenage girl girl who receives a letter from her future self saying that if she does not change some things, then somebody who is just transferred into her class will not be with them by the end of the year. So she tries to change everything that she can possibly can, fix the things that her future self regrets to ensure that this boy stays in their friendship group. In the main series, you have two timelines. You have the main character Naho as a teenager trying to change the things that her future self regrets, and then you also have a few sections from the perspective of Naho and her friendship group in the future when everything has already transpired and they are sending these letters back to the past. So you already have a future perspective of what will happen if nothing changes, if everything goes on as it has in the previous timeline. So what I expected from this was a future perspective where the events had been changed. This follows one of my favorite characters from the series, Suwa, and I do really think that it would have been interesting to get his perspective after the timeline had been changed, because his future would look very different based on the events of what happens in the timeline and where he is in the alternate future timeline. However, these are just future short stories if the timeline had never changed, so it kind of bridges the gap in some ways between the characters' high school years and the place that we already know where they are in the future perspective that is in the core series. You guys did tell me not to read this. You told me that it wasn't very good, but I do really love this series, so I wanted to just finish it off and read everything that is available in this world. I don't necessarily regret reading it because now at least I've read it, and to be honest, I've forgotten most of what happens in here anyway, so it isn't like it's tainted my original perspective on the series. But yeah, I just felt like it was kind of unnecessary, and this is not the perspective that we needed, but I would have really loved a storyline in the future of the changed timeline. Next up, we have an interesting one because that is Catching Fire by Suzanne Collins. This was a reread for me. I previously read the series when I was 18, absolutely adored it. In my mind, it was one of my favorite series. So I decided to reread this because for years now I have been wanting to reread The Hunger Games. This was before I knew that Suzanne Collins was even going to be releasing a prequel book, and I did actually start my reread of this in 2019. Was disappointed, but I do kind of want to carry it through and see the series out, so I did continue in 2020. I'm not really going to go too in depth on the plot of The Hunger Games because I'm sure that the majority of you guys know, but we are following a girl called Katniss Everdeen who lives in this world that is separated into districts and everybody is very much oppressed, and then every 12 months a boy and a girl under the age of 18 from each district is randomly selected and put in an arena to fight to the death. So this was my favorite book in the series. It may still be my favorite book in the series. I just don't like the series very much anymore, but I love the plot of this one. I love some of the characters that are introduced in here. I mean, everybody loves Finnick Odair, and I will admit that there are some series that I read when I was much younger that I will never reread because I just don't think I will like them now, and I want to preserve my positive feelings on them. One of these series is Twilight, another one is Vampire Academy, but I really did not think that The Hunger Games was going to fall into this category, but sadly it does. In this book especially, I think that the pacing is incredibly off. There is a second arena in this book, and in my mind that was always the main event of the second installment, but it takes up the last 100 pages of a book that is over 450 pages long. The character of Katniss Everdeen I have always found infuriating. I have never really liked her, and now that I'm reading it while I'm older, I have noticed that is because she is so very much in her head. The first 200 pages of this is pretty much a inner monologue. Going back to the pacing, there are quite interesting events in here. We have a second repin, there is a victory tour, and it is very much glossed over. I believe the victory tour, you get 2 scenes out of it and the rest of it just flies by. And I also think that the repin takes place in the space of a paragraph. Because Katniss is so like turned inward mentally, she is always kind of focusing on herself, which does make sense because there is elements of PTSD throughout this series, which rightfully so after what the characters go through in the first book, but she is always focusing on what is about to happen as opposed to what is happening. And I don't know whether it's like dissociation and compartmentalization, but she just isn't focusing on what's happening. And I do feel like if we are going to dive into the mental health rep in here, that does make sense, but in terms of building a compelling narrative in a really interesting and well thought out dystopian society, it just really detracts the reader from the interesting points. Like, I don't want 200 pages of Katniss's thoughts. I want to learn about the victory tour because I'm pretty sure it's the only one we ever see in the series. I want to see this second repin and the impact that it has on everybody else and how dramatic and shocking it is. And I want more than 100 pages in this really cool arena in the real really cool version of the Hunger Games, but you just don't get it in here. You just don't get it. So I'm probably going to finish my reread. I'm in no hurry because it is a reread. I will be rereading Mockingjay at some point, but then after that I'm not sure if I'm going to read the prequel, and this will be going in a mental box with Twilight and Vampire Academy as a series that I will not reread again, because I do just really want to preserve the positive feelings I have about this. Next up we have quite a recent read, and that is This Savage Song by V. Schwab, but just generally both books in this duology, as I have read them both at the end of 2020. This is a young adult fantasy series that takes place in a city that is overrun with monsters. The monsters are created by violent acts, so if you murder somebody, a monster will be created and then will proceed to terrorize the city. This city has been split into two sections. You have the north that is run by the Harkers and the south that is run by the Flynns. Our two main characters in here are Kate and August. Kate is a Harker and they protect their citizens by charging for it, and August is a Flynn and they protect their citizens, I guess the more traditional way, by actually going out and actively trying to stop the monsters and the spread of this big monster plague. Now V. Schwab is a very hit or miss author with me, as you are going to see over the coming days. I read the Dark Shade of Magic series back in 2015, didn't really think much of it, but I have been buddy reading all of V. Schwab's books with Jade from Jade Ray Reads for the second half of 2020, and a couple of the books that she's written have become my new favourites. However, we still have ones like this that I am completely ambivalent towards. This has some of my favourite themes. There is a lot of grey morality in this series, as Kate, while being a human, wants to be as monstrous as her father, whereas we have August, who is a monster who really wants to hold on to his humanity. Morally grey characters are my favourite, like most of my favourite characters are morally grey, but for some reason with this one I just didn't really resonate with the main characters at all. I did think that there was a lot of potential with the side characters in here, especially the characters of Leo, Ilsa, and then in our dark duet Sorrow as well, and I just think that there was a lot of room for development, growth and complexity within those side characters that V. Schwab just never explored. This duology overall is quite fast paced. The first one especially is full of action scenes. I think the entire like second half of the book is pretty much back-to-back action, and personal preference wise I don't love fast-paced stories. I definitely love a book that has a slow start with like hundreds of pages of character development and world building, and I think that that could possibly be the cause of my disconnect with this. That being said, there are some fast-paced stories that I do enjoy, but then overall with this I can't really say too much of a negative thing about it, even though it does have elements that I don't like. The fact that it has grey morality and a really interesting world that I do actually enjoy should on paper make up for the fact that this is faster paced. However, I am just utterly ambivalent towards this duology. I have no idea what the core reason for that is, but this one just really did not resonate with me. So if you do like faster paced stories, if you're interested in the concept of this series, I would definitely recommend that you pick it up, because I have noticed that through all of V. Schwab's books she has a very different tone and approach to each series or project that she works on. So the chances are that you could be like me, where some of them you really love and some of them just don't resonate with you like this one didn't for me. I want to say that this is my biggest disappointment of the year, but I have no like groundwork to lay for why it was so disappointing. For some reason I just assumed that I was really gonna love this book and I didn't, and that one is Bonecryer's Moon by Catherine Purdy. So this follows three main characters. We have Aeless and Sabine, who are potential Bonecryers, and we have Bastion, who has a score to settle with the Bonecryers because his father was killed by one when he was a child. Bonecryers are women who ferry the spirits of the dead to the gates of heaven and hell, and to become a Bonecryer they must accomplish a series of tasks. The first thing that they need to do is kill 3 animals and take their bones to wear as a piece of jewelry to inherit the graces of these animals. So if you kill a bird you will have enhanced eyesight and things like that. Then the next thing they must do is play the siren song on a bridge at the full moon to summon their soulmate, who they then must kill within a 1-year period to finally become a Bonecryer. So Aeless is at the point where she is to play her siren song and summon her soulmate, and Bastion has been lingering at bridges on the full moon to hopefully encounter a Bonecryer that he can kill. So these two get into an altercation. Bastion wants to kill Aeless, however they come to the conclusion that he may actually be her soulmate, so he can't kill her because if he does then he will die as well. He then kidnaps Aeless, and Sabine, who doesn't really want to be a Bonecryer because she doesn't like killing things, is tasked with getting her best friend back. So I really love the cover of this. This one in particular is an Owlcrate edition, but the standard cover of this is absolutely beautiful. So I was drawn in by the cover. I knew that this would have heavy romantic themes, and I adore fantasy romance, and the concept, especially dealing with life and death, was really appealing to me. However, this just missed its mark for me, and there's no concrete reason why. One thing that I can say is that I really enjoyed the writing in here. Catherine Purdy's writing is very readable but not overly simplistic, so I did really enjoy that element of it. I think that the plot structure may be one of the reasons why I didn't love this, because unlike typical fantasy stories, there is no enemy to overcome in this book. The characters are trying to solve a problem, and Sabine is trying to get A-list back, but there is no big bad to defeat, no oppressive government to overthrow. And I feel like because of how much fantasy I read, and I'm really familiar with that structure, I was kind of waiting for something in this book that just didn't really happen. I didn't feel particularly attached to any of the characters, and I think that especially when we're dealing with a book that has heavy romantic themes, that is definitely a key point for me. I have to root for the heroine, I have to like the love interest for it to really hit with me. And even though after the first 50 pages in here we have around 150 pages of pretty much just character development, I just wasn't really feeling them. So this is one that I didn't particularly like. Once again, can't really say too many negative things about it. It just wasn't really for me, and I probably won't be reading the sequel. I'm undecided, I may do, but at this moment it is definitely not a priority. I don't know how many books are going to be in this series, so I may wait until it's all done and then go back and binge them, because that is definitely an approach that I want to be taking with series going forwards anyway. Next up we have King of Scars by Leigh Bardugo. This is the first book in the third series in the Grishaverse. The first series in the Grishaverse is the Grisha trilogy, which is your standard young adult uprising story. Then we have the Six of Crows duology, which I believe is going to have an additional book in a couple of years, and that one is a very character driven heist story. And then we have King of Scars, which is the first book in the Nikolai duology. The second book will be released, I believe, in March 2021. I think it's called Rule of Wolves, and this one follows two characters from the Grisha trilogy, Nikolai and Zoya, and one from the Six of Crows duology, which is Nina. The central themes in this book is dealing with personal demons, some quite literally, some more figuratively, but essentially every character that we follow in here has something in their past that we've already seen in the first two series in the Grishaverse that has made a lasting impression on them, like a negative lasting impression, and they are trying to overcome this to move forward in a whole variety of ways. So I gave this one 3 stars. It is now my lowest rated Leigh Bardugo book that I've read, and I do believe at this moment, now that Lives of Saints has just been released, there are only 3 books by her that I haven't yet read. I'm really surprised that I didn't love this, because Nikolai is my favorite character from the Grishaverse world, but I think one of the main things for me with this is that it felt like a story that could be told as opposed to a story that had to be told. Because of that, I didn't find anything to be like super overwhelming. I wasn't overly rooting for the characters. The stakes didn't seem as high as they have in the 2 previous Grishaverse series. One of my main problems with this though is that I don't feel like the perspective of Nina needed to be included. That being said, I think that it is going to come together in the second book and the storylines are going to converge. But in this book we have Nikolai and Zoya who are trying to rebuild Ravka after the events of the Grisha trilogy, and then we have Nina in a completely separate part of the world working on her own thing as a continuation of the plot of Six of Crows. So I do think in the sequel they are going to both come together. However, in terms of this as a singular book with a sequel not yet released, I did find the narrative to be very disjointed because of that. While I said that this is a story that can be told as opposed to a story that needs to be told, I do think that Nina has a reasonably compelling narrative. I just think that maybe it would have worked better if we had a book that focused on Nikolai and Zoya and then a separate series that focused on Nina, as opposed to having them both crammed into this book with little cohesion to tie them together. And then the final book or books we are going to be talking about today, I feel is the one that you guys are going to hate me the most for, because it is the 3 books in the Books of Earthsea by Ursula K. Le Guin that I read in 2020, because I did not enjoy any of them, albeit for different reasons. So if you are unfamiliar with this is a classic fantasy series. The installments in the series mostly follow different things, but in the first one we are following a young boy called Ged who proves himself to be very talented with magic, so he is sent to a magic school where while he is showing off he releases this shadowy demon thing that he then has to go and hunt down. This is a fantasy staple. This series introduced a lot of the tropes that that are now very common in fantasy today, a very prominent one being magic schools. I just feel like the tone of this series and the style of the way that it's written just does not mesh with things that I like to read. As I mentioned, I did have a different problem with each of the 3 books that I read. The first one is that it has very little plot. The second one is that it did have plot, but I just wasn't very interested in it. I felt like it dragged, and I actually don't even remember what my problem with the third one was, because it kind of fixed the problems that I had with the first 2, but I still didn't enjoy it. One of the main reasons why I wasn't particularly fond of any of these books is that they are very heavily moralistic, and personal preference, I do not like to read heavily moralistic stories. Every book contains at least one moral. There are messages hidden throughout the pages of, I'm willing to say, every single book. However, I don't like it when they're at the forefront. In this world, the magic is very much about give and take and balance, and I didn't like how much this book just pushed the message as opposed to providing like a compelling plot and compelling characters. Aside from that, all of these books are incredibly slow paced, and Ursula K. Le Guin is a huge fan of an info dump. A lot of the first book revolves around sailing, so Ged will sail to this island and do whatever he wants to do on this island, because Earthsea is literally like hundreds of islands, and we had pages and pages of sailing terminology that I just was not interested in. Every time Ged arrived at a new location, we would have a full page, and the text in here is tiny, let me tell you. There would be a full page of just description, so it would be like, this is a rocky plain, over there are 3 houses, and all of this stuff that just wasn't really needed. It kind of just painted this picture of the landscape, and then Ged went off and did whatever he was going to do, and then you moved on to another island, and I just didn't really like it. I found it very jarring, and I would much have preferred if the world was built as Ged encounters it, as a more natural, like integrated part of the story. I also don't particularly like the magic system in here. It is a very soft magic system with very little kind of limitations and rules, and once again, personal preference, I am a big fan of a hard magic system that has lots of rules and lots of limitations. So I do like some stories that have soft magic systems, but this one just kind of had no rhyme or reason, no set down logic aside from like this give and take policy, and I was confused, and I just could not get behind that. That being said, I do also acknowledge that this is a classic. This was one of the building blocks of fantasy as we know it today. So I do think that the reason that I don't love this is because I'm reading modern fantasy that have taken these building blocks that Ursula K. Le Guin built and embellished it into something new. Fantasy is very different than it was, especially at this time. Fantasy wasn't really an established genre, and for a woman to be writing it, a really big deal. So while I don't like this series very much, while I found it incredibly tedious and hard to get through, you do have to give Ursula K. Le Guin credit for creating this, because if she hadn't, then fantasy would not be like it is today. And I do think that it is just that I have read a lot of modern fantasy. I don't think I've read anything that's before like 1990, so I've read the last 30 years of fantasy. I appreciate what Ursula K. Le Guin did. I can see the origins of a lot of my favorite tropes in here, but just style, it's not for me, and I really didn't enjoy it. I do want to finish this series, because one thing I did enjoy going through this is looking out for all of the things that I'm familiar with and seeing the origins of that, and it is something that I'm wishing to pursue with other genres, like finding the roots of the themes and things like folklore and mythology. So I do want to finish it for that reason, but just in terms of like a compelling narrative and characters that I enjoy and root for, this series did not have it for me. So there you have it. Those are my 7 most disappointing books of the year. Please let me know down in the comments what your most disappointing book of the year is. Also let me know if you enjoyed any of these and the things that you did like about them, because while all of these were my most disappointing books of the year, I definitely do think that all of them have their merits, and every single one of them contained at least a couple of elements that I did actually really enjoy. But that is it from me today, guys. Please don't forget to tune in tomorrow for my most surprising books of the year, and aside from that, please don't forget to like this video if you liked it and subscribe if you wanna. If you head into my description box, you'll find a link to my Goodreads, Instagram and Twitter if you'd like to follow me on any of those, as well as a link to my Bookish body butter and candle website, the Instagram for that, and a 10% off discount code. But that's it from me today, guys. Bye!
Oh, you bite your friend like chocolate. You say you'll go when nobody knows. ghosts with guns hidden under our petticoats. We're never gonna quit it, no, we're never gonna quit it, no.